So there again, you lose, Walmart wins. And this happens over and over in any number of ways. And it's not just Walmart. I'm just picking on them because there were some of the more egregious examples of this kind of behavior, and because they were referenced in the story before the last one. So the larger economic picture in this country is very complex, and there are a lot of factors that are working together to create the situation that we're in now. You hear a lot of rhetoric about the 1% having all the money. Well, that's partly due to tax policy and other government policies that have been implemented over the last, I don't know, since the 1980s, where they've been lowering taxes on wealthy people and providing benefits for them that they were closing up for other people. So, and loosening regulations and weakening unions and doing all these different things that probably at the time a lot of people were applauding these things, going, yeah, take back the power from the unions. But they didn't realize who was taking the power back from the unions, and that was the employers. And the employers are now paying lower wages. They are cutting their workforce. They're outsourcing their work to other countries. They're buying products in other countries that are produced more cheaply, which means a lot of manufacturing is shut down here. People are out of work. They're outsourcing as much labor as they can to other countries that pay lower wages, meaning people are out of work here. So that's all part of this interdependent system that is creating the situation that people find themselves in. But you have to understand how all of those things work together in order to understand what the problem is. It is much, much easier to just believe someone who comes in with a funny hairdo and says, well, your problems are these people right here. If we just get rid of them, everything will be fine. And unfortunately, that's what seems to be happening in a lot of to a lot of people. So here's something from Bloomberg Business Week entitled, "Americans Really Don't Like Immigration." So we've just been talking about where they get the idea that it's a bad thing from. Now let's find out what they think about it. So it says 61% of Americans agree that continued immigration into the country jeopardizes the United States, according to a new poll commissioned by management consulting firm A.T. Kearney that revealed pessimism across a wide range of issues. The degree of concern is remarkable, considering that the question was about all immigration, including the legal kind. Even Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump has said he supports legal immigration into the U.S. A.T. Kearney gave Bloomberg Businessweek an exclusive first look at the results of the survey, which covers 2,590 respondents and is part of an American 250 study that's intended to gauge the nation's direction with 10 years to go before its 250th birthday. The study, which will be posted online later this month, was conducted last October and November by NPD Group. The political climate may help account for Americans' immigration fears, says Paul Laudicina, chairman of the Global Business Policy Council, which is a unit of A.T. Kearney. Given what's going on in the national discourse and the desperate state of national politics, it makes people vulnerable to jingoistic sloganeering, he said in an interview. A belief that immigration jeopardizes the U.S. was common across age groups, although highest among baby boomers, 65%, and lowest among millennials, 55%. By education, it was highest among those with just a high school education or some college, and by region, it was highest in the South, including Texas. So this is exactly what I was just saying. There were lots of other sour findings in the survey. 58% of respondents agreed with the statement, quote, "I'm not confident in the U.S. economy's ability to return to stronger growth." Well, yeah. 52% agreed U.S. businesses will be increasingly uncompetitive. And 51% agreed my vote doesn't matter because politics in Washington will never change. On the plus side, 85% of respondents agreed that technological progress in a range of sectors will boost U.S. productivity and economic growth. American public opinion is very much in a state of flux, says Laudicina. You can make a case that people are more reasonable and more optimistic than you would be willing to guess based on the nature of the political dialogue. The A.T. Kearney survey seems to show more negativity toward immigration than other recent surveys, although it's hard to tell because each one uses its own question wording. A Pew Research Center study conducted in August through October found that 53% of respondents thought immigration strengthened the U.S. versus 38% who thought it burdened them. In a Gallup poll in June, 34% of respondents favored a decrease in immigration. 25% favored a increase, and 40% favored keeping it at current levels. What is clear is that Americans are more down on immigration than in past eras. As recently as 2002, the Harris poll found that only 1% of Americans mentioned immigration, including refugees, when asked to name the two most important issues for the government to address. That rose to 19% last year. So we can see from this that all this constant talk about immigration and painting it in a negative light has dramatically increased the number of people who just think it's just bad, and they're not focused. You know, you have, for example, they mentioned Trump again in this article. He's everywhere. He's anti-illegal immigration, if I can use that I word there, and he's pro-legal immigration. And yet, even that very, kind of basic message is lost on lower information observers who just go, oh, immigrants bad. Okay, immigrants are bad. All of them. Why? They're all bad. Just get rid of all of them. So it's this, you create this sort of sense that there's just something wrong with these people. And that builds until, it becomes very easy to not just look at immigrants, but just assume that immigrants are people that look different than I do, have a different religion or different language or a different something, different culture. So people who look different or have a different language or whatever or culture are bad by definition. It doesn't take too much thinking to see how these kind of basic ideas become even more basic and even more spread out and more comprehensive until they just become, a basic negative opinion about the other or different people who are different from you. So you may wonder, how did this come about? So in part, again, talking about Trump, it's also part of a political situation. So I ran across this earlier, and I thought this was a good topic. So this is a little more politics and Republicans and Democrats versus immigration. But when I read it, you'll get a greater sense of where this stuff is coming from. So this is from TalkingPointsMemo.com. When people try to make sense of this topsy-turvy, norm-busting election year, one of the key mistakes they make is to assume that the dynamics that operate for Donald Trump in the Republican primary will operate in a general election. They won't. I'm not saying Trump can't win a national election. In a Clinton v. Trump matchup, I think anything from a shattering defeat to a narrow Trump victory is possible. But many people now believe that Trump can defy political gravity, flouting conventions of propriety, embracing extremist positions, casually changing positions, all with no penalty. That won't work in a general election. The key to understanding the Trump phenomena, his ability to do all these things and pay no price, is that it has very little to do with Trump and almost everything to do with the portion of the electorate he is currently operating. The current Republican Party is built in large part on roughly 25 to 30% of the voting electorate, which is radicalized and revanchist, a topic I discussed in a different article. We can think about the nature of Trump's appeal in three basic ways. First, it is simple political substance. Readers of this site are entirely familiar with the fact that a large segment of the American right is animated by a belief that their world, their America, is being taken away from them. This includes everything from declining white racial dominance, having to choose whether you want to hear the phone tree message in English or Spanish, changing cultural mores, the whole package. This is the essence of Trump's campaign, beating back the external threat, the harsh anti-immigrant policies, Muslim bans, flirting with white supremacists. This is the most visible and literal part of Trump's appeal. Second is the appeal to power and force. Trump is the master of GOP dominance politics, the inherent appeal of power and the ability to dominate others. All of this has a deep appeal to Americans' authoritarian right, especially in a climate of perceived threat, which has been growing over the last 2 decades, something political scientists are now catching up on. We might think of this as the embodiment and acting out of the policy drives noted above. The phenomena of the imperiled resentment right is something you're very well familiar with if you're a close observer of American politics. As I noted back in December, that we were seeing this show up in the demographic data in the unprecedented rising mortality rates of middle-aged whites from chronic substance abuse, overdose, and suicide. And as the Washington Post's Jeff Guo noted last week, the states where middle-aged whites are dying fastest heavily correlate with the states where Trump has had his highest margins. Think about that for a second. Trump's message and policy agenda hits every dimension of threat and change. The third factor is, I think, the least obvious, but for these purposes the most important. On the radicalized, revanchist right, provocation and transgression of norms isn't simply indulged. It functions as a positive good. It is a feature, not a bug, to use the tech phrase. What the mainstream electorate might view as an outrage is actually signal of the willingness to tear down a corrupt order that is unwilling or unable to turn back the tide of threat. So whether or not you think it's a good idea to kill terrorists' families, saying you will is a signal that you won't accept limits. How can Trump break all the rules and pay no price? What's his magic? Changing your positions, obviously lying, taunting enemies. None of these hurt Trump because his core supporters are not seeing them through the same prism you likely are. They're not signs of deception, bad character, or untrustworthiness. They all signal a refusal to accept the norms of the threatening order and thus a willingness to overturn it. To put this more simply, you're being too literal. While the Trump movement is heavily tinged by racial backlash, it's not like all Trump backers would embrace outright white nationalism. But that's not the point. Provocation is a feature, not a bug. But this isn't how the great majority of the American public approaches the world or our national politics. Indeed, the divide is what's tearing the GOP in half at the moment, because it's a very big chunk of the Republican Party. To put this concretely, most Democrats will never support Trump for simple policy reasons, even if there are segments of the Democratic coalition that might. But what we're talking about here is a distinction between policy and political mentality, specifically a view of politics based on resentment and desire for revenge, and that operates with a large minority but not close to a majority of the electorate. As long as there is not an organized conservative third-party candidate in the election, I think the overwhelming power of contemporary partisanship will pull the vast majority of anti-Trump mainstream into the Republican Trump-supporting camp. But Republicans and Republican-leaning independents don't make up 51% of the electorate. What all of this means is that a Trump v. Clinton general election will be fought over the roughly 10% of the electorate, which is not firmly anchored in the right, center-right, or left, center-left blocks of American politics. It will likely be fought out over the distinction between Trump's policies and the Democrats, but it will be fought out on conventional political norms, not ones in which rule-breaking and transgressive behavior are positive good in themselves. This is not wishful thinking. It's based on a clear understanding of the structure of contemporary politics, one backed up by Trump's negative favorability ratings, which have never topped the mid-30s and are now trending down. So we should not expect that Trump will be able to easily switch gears to become a candidate of racial unity, or that it won't boomerang on him if we find him calling Clinton Little Hillary at a debate in October. That doesn't mean he can't win. It means that we shouldn't think his political magic is about him. It's about his audience. And there's a follow-up piece to this that I also wanted to read because I want you to get the whole picture. This is from the same author, same site. So there's a point I wanted to address about the GOP primaries and the Trump phenomena that connects up with my piece this morning and an earlier post on the GOP implosion and the concept of technical debt. I was listening to a CPAC roundtable last week where the panelists, including the Weekly Standard's Fred Barnes, discussed the basic division in the GOP today between people who feel the party establishment has betrayed them and those who do not. I could dig up polls that substantiate this, but there's abundant political opinion data confirming this division. The only surprise is how abruptly and destructively it's played out in this primary process. But it's worth unpacking just what this means. We can't do a deep interpretation that places this sense of betrayal in the declining economic prospects for many middle-class Republican voters, or the broader climate of ethnic and cultural transformation in the country. But at least nominally, it's not about either one of those things. I'm not so sure about that, but anyway. The betrayal is that the GOP promised it would destroy Obama's presidency and turn back the various things he's done to damage the country and transform it. But let's remember that Republicans played a high-stakes game of brinksmanship in 2011, threatening to default on the national debt if President Obama didn't comply with various demands, an event totally without precedent in more than 2 centuries of American history. Then there was the Cruz government shutdown in 2013 to attempt to force yet another showdown over Obamacare. There was a successful effort to kill immigration reform in 2013. There's the current refusal to even receive the president's nomination to fill a Supreme Court vacancy at the beginning of the 4th year of his term. Again, totally unprecedented in American history. And these are only some of the most high-stake examples. I've never been terribly impressed when people note Mitch McConnell's early declaration that his primary goal in opposition was to ensure that President Obama was a one-term president. That's almost always an opposition leader's goal. The difference was that he said it out loud and how far he proved willing to take it. But by almost any objective standard, congressional Republicans have taken a long list of either rare or totally unprecedented actions to fight President Obama. And they've accomplished a fair amount, though largely in negative terms. A large portion of the GOP is not satisfied with what can realistically be achieved by conventional political means. One might even add here, working with allies on the Supreme Court to come close to overturning Obamacare on what were extremely flimsy grounds. Yes, it's a bummer to take over the House and later the Senate and still have Obamacare, but as long as you have a relatively popular president with a veto pen, that's life. You need to elect a president too. As I noted at the end of last month, some of this product of hate debt and nonsense debt, building up wildly unrealistic expectations by overpromising and trading in an increasingly apocalyptic political rhetoric. But that's not all of it. Something this powerful, as we've discussed, isn't just ginned up by political leaders. It runs much deeper. But again, the overreaching point is important. The narrative of betrayal at this volume and intensity only makes sense if you are dealing with a chunk of the electorate with expectations that are deeply unrealistic in the context of conventional political action. That is a volatile situation when you're talking about at least a quarter of the national electorate. That gets you Trump. It also gets you Ted Cruz, and it may get you worse still. So I read both of those to kind of give you a sense of another way of looking at what's going on here. So you have Trump on the one hand, who is, and Cruz is doing it too. Actually, all the Republican candidates are demonizing immigration and immigrants in different ways. And it went from being something that just a few people in that party did to something that's virtually a litmus test for whether you can even be called a Republican at all. You have to be against, at least against illegal immigration, i.e., I hate to use that I word, but at least people coming here without documentation. You have to absolutely be against that in no uncertain terms and totally unforgiving of it in every way in order to be a Republican. But in some sense, you have to be against immigration, period, because you're against immigrants, because you're against people from somewhere else who look, sound, and act, dress, behave, whatever you want to say, differently from you. These are all sort of basic tenets of the modern Republican Party. And their behavior treats this and any number of other things as pretty much just a patriotic position. This isn't a partisan thing in their eyes. This is an American thing. This is the true American way, and anybody who speaks against it is not a true American. And that's where you get a lot of this absolutist rhetoric that comes from this party. They reject the current president and have since the beginning, and will go out of their way to absolutely do nothing to help him. Why? You can claim there are any number of reasons, but really what it boils down to, I mean, this is a guy who is not particularly liberal. He is maybe center-left at best, and yet he's painted as a socialist, as an outsider, and all sorts of things. So it's partly racism. Let's just use the R word and get it out in the open. And it's partly just this idea that this fight against difference. So where it is not absolutely racist in the strictest terms, like, hey, he's black, therefore he's bad, it is at least, hey, he's different from me in some basic way, therefore he's bad. And that has become sort of today's version of racism, if you will. It's kind of like it's gone beyond the older, more simplistic understandings of race, as in, it's skin color, it's the kind of hair you have, it's the way your eyes look, it's the, whatever that thing is that people used to base their racism on. It's spread out. It's now about poor people are bad. It's about people who are different are bad. People who speak a different language, have a different religion. All those things make you automatically bad and someone to reject and someone to be suspicious of and someone to work against, fight against. And that is the new kind of an invented, I guess you might say, bigotry. It's sort of a reaching out and bringing together all the different sorts of bigotry that have existed for forever and ever, and just lumping them into one grand capital B bigotry that exists in this country now, where it can be any one of those things. It can be any combination of any one of those things. And people feel justified in it now because it's not any one thing. And so they really do honestly resent being called racists or whatever that people call them, because they feel, and they can honestly, at least consciously say, I'm not being racist. I am rejecting this because of this reason, or I am rejecting this because of that reason, or whatever. There are plenty of reasons. Once you've swept together all these little tidbits of individual bigotry and put it into one giant container and colored it all the same color, then it's easy to play this dance of avoidance when someone tries to point out what you're doing, because you can say, oh, this is about the economy. This is about religious freedom. This is about this right or this good or that bad. It's about all these different things. And it's the new way that I guess you could call it the right wing of current politics in this country. It is the new way that they have discovered to kind of allow themselves the freedom to be against all sorts of different things, but to just put it together under a single heading and and make it themselves blame free because they don't like being called racists. They don't like being called bigots. They don't like any of that stuff. They reject it, and rightfully so, because those are strong words and they have very negative connotations. But this is how they're doing it. In case you're curious, and if you were listening, or if you're wondering what's going on in the country, this kind of is a very simplistic way of explaining a lot of what people are doing these days, and how they imagine they're getting away with it. The rest of us, for the most part, are not fooled by any of this, but it does make the conversation more difficult because it's harder to pin somebody down when they're so slippery, when they do not stand behind any individual point, but just kind of slide back and forth between points and say, oh, no, it's this, or no, it's that. And by moving around like that, it makes it very difficult to fight this stuff because it's not easy to just point at it and say, this is wrong, and here's why, because you can't put your finger on it. It's got too many dimensions. So anyway, I know this seems like it's maybe gotten off the topic of immigration a little bit, but immigration is rolled into that because immigrants are generally part of this issue, and there are any number of things about immigrants that fit under this like sort of mass uppercase B bigotry. A lot of immigrants speak a different language. A lot of immigrants have a different ethnicity than the standard European descendant type of thing, which is so popular in this country. A lot of immigrants have a different religion, and so on and so on. So when they come here, the finger is pointed at them in all sorts of different ways at different times for whatever's the most convenient in the situation, and they feel rejected without really being able to understand what it is that's coming at them. Without it's like, well, I didn't do this. I didn't do this thing that I'm being accused of. But it's not about you. It's about how you fit into this larger picture of anti whatever. I mean, it's hard to, I wish I should have thought about this before I started talking about it, because then I could have come up with better descriptive terms for what I'm saying. But it's part of this larger picture, and you are just a scapegoat, or you're a victim of it, and that's why it's so hard to deal with, and it's so hard to push back against. But it's something we all need to be aware of if we're going to understand what's going on in this country and fight it and try to change it, because it is not fair, it's not right, and it's not good. And I think we need to work on it, and in order to work on it, we need to understand what it is. So anyway, I have run out of time here. You have been listening to CU Immigration here on WRFU LP Urbana 104.5 FM. We come to you every week with topics vaguely around or interest to, or interesting news and tidbits about the issue of immigration, and I hope that you will tune in again. Sorry, I'm twiddling knobs here and trying to talk at the same time, and apparently I lack the skill to do that. So thank you for tuning in, and my voice is going away, so I'm just going to leave it at that, and we'll see you next week. Bye.